All right, guys, we are ready to go to the next phase of world building, talking about the poetics of invention. And this section is called Mythopoeia, which is a big $10 transmedia word, world building word that refers to the finishing details that make your world come alive. Okay, the finishing details that make your world come alive. So J.R. Tolkien coined this term Mythopoeia, and he referred to the finishing details of the world, insofar as you have your character groups, you have all the big architectural elements of your world, right? So we have a soapbox, we have a world that needs the soapbox, we have a special sauce and a high concept that forms the big idea. Once we have the big idea, we then set the geography of the world. The geography of the world is defined by primary location, secondary location. We really order that by way of a map. Then we populate that world, make sure that world is populated by 9 very specific character groups that are ideologically different. They see the world differently. They're philosophically different in a lot of different ways, which brings more conflict. Then we identify the main hero group, what we call the hero group of the 9, the one that we think we're going to get our most of our protagonists out of, and we segment that in a way that really attracts and connects with different types of people, and then we create hierarchies that our groups can ascend and descend in a valuable way. Those are all the architectural elements that we need for a world. So if you imagine somebody building a house, you lay the foundation, you frame it up, you put the roof on, right? You put the front door on, you have all the big stuff in line, but that doesn't mean that the house is ready to live in. And so what you need to do is you need to paint the walls and call in the interior decorator and lay the carpet and put the furniture in there, and et cetera, et cetera. Those finishing details is what makes it livable, and that is what Tolkien refers to as Mythopoeia. And obviously, Tolkien knows a thing or two about world building. So when it comes to world building and Mythopoeia, Tolkien says that there are 4 very specific elements or parts of Mythopoeia that we need to consider. And the first of the 4 is what we call flora. Okay, flora, which is unique plant life in the world. Unique plant life in the world. Tolkien says every good story world has some uniquely identifiable plant life that he refers to as flora. So let's check out some examples of that. So the first example of that would be if you go to Pandora in Avatar, and Pandora has the soul seeds in Avatar. Actually, Pandora has about 120 different types of unique animals and unique flora, which make that world really super interesting. And the soul seeds are just one of them. But what's cool about this is that if you went to Pandora and it had all the same plants as Earth, it would be boring, and wouldn't be as interesting or as unique. And so the fact that they invested so much in that world building with so many different unique plants and types of flora just makes that world better, right? Which is pretty cool. The mandrakes in Harry Potter, these like screaming roots and plants that you deal with when you're in school. Those are pretty cool. The whomping willow in Harry Potter, another really super interesting part of the flora of that world. Fire flowers, Super Mario Brothers. I mean, obviously, if you ever played Super Mario Brothers, the fire flowers are just tremendously interesting asset. And it's not the only flora that they have. They have the sort of the plants that come out of the out of the tubes that eat you, and different kinds of flowers, right? But the fire flowers would be a type of flora for that world. The Laganophilus from The Sims, super interesting plant. If you ever played The Sims, that after it consumes a sim, it has these like life giving powers that it has, that it secretes, which is weird and bizarre. But again, just a unique aspect of that story world. Nightlock in Hunger Games, right? So these poisonous berries, really interesting element of the flora of the Hunger Games. White Claudia from Silent Hill. This is the plants that they uh, they create the drug, some psychological, psychotic drug out of yeah, in that game, right? So all these are elements of flora, and from fictional universes and from story worlds, just something unique about those story worlds. If you're dealing with a real world story world, then you just need to do some research to see what type of flora is unique to that part of the world. And so if you're in Northern California, then you would identify the redwoods as the flora of that world. Or if you've ever been to Washington D.C. in the spring, you know that it is gorgeous because the cherry blossoms bloom, and they were a gift from Japan after World War II, and they're not indigenous to the United States, but we have them in Washington D.C., and that makes Washington D.C. this unique thing, right, in the spring. And so if you're doing a House of Cards type of a Washington D.C. story world, you want to make sure that you note the cherry blossoms so that just it's realistic and interesting, and separates it from just any other sort of large city in the United States. So that's flora, right? You don't necessarily have to make a catalog of every single plant in the world. Just what is the most interesting, the things that can really kind of drive a lot of really interesting identity in that world, which I think will help you, whether it's sci-fi, whether it's fantasy, whether it's real world. Flora always will still pertain to world building. Then he says the next aspect of Mythopoeia is fauna, which is unique animal life. So Tolkien was bullish on flora and fauna, that good story worlds will have both, right? So so when it comes to fauna, again, Avatar in Pandora, they had a ton of these really interesting animals that they incorporated, making this world unique. There were mountain banshees that they would ride. There's others, but these were pretty cool ones. In Harry Potter, obviously we had Fawkes, which again, interesting type of a bird. The mockingjay, another interesting type of bird in the Hunger Games universe. That is sort of the fictional bird that's used as a symbol, obviously, for hope and freedom in that world. Game of Thrones, obviously, ravens are super important to that world, as well as dragons. Dragons would be another big element of Game of Thrones that you would want to include. The porgs, and we all love the porgs in Star Wars, right? So one of the best elements of The Last Jedi were the porgs. Super cute little things that had a good little sea story with Chewbacca, which was kind of cool. So the porgs, super important aspect of the and listen, Star Wars has a zillion things in that universe that that pertain to the flora and the fauna of that world. We could teach flora and fauna just out of the Star Wars universe and never have to leave, right? But the porg is just one element of that. In The Walking Dead, you have Shiva, which is cool. Like, in a world where the society breaks down, you have zoo animals that sort of, become household pets and things like that. Shiva was a really interesting element of the later seasons of The Walking Dead. If you have a real world story world, obviously do your research of what type of animals actually live in that story world. So, if you have something like the Jungle Book, really do that research to make sure you're including animals that actually live in the jungle. If it's set in China, Chengdu, is known for its pandas. And so you want to make sure you incorporate that. If you're doing something in Florida or maybe the bayou, right, you want to make sure you incorporate alligators. Again, this is fauna that is part and parcel of that world, whether it's real, whether it's fantasy, whether it's sci-fi, whether it's dystopian. Make sure you have some unique animals, and that will help make that story world even more unique. So we have flora, we have fauna, but then we also, by the way, before we move on, as you're dealing with your fauna, make sure that you make a distinction between, what animals are wild, what are domesticated, even what animals are sentient, right? So like in Star Wars, you have the Ewoks, right? It's sort of these little bears, but they're not really would be considered animals. That would actually be a sentient race of beings that are just like people, not really what we would. So there's a difference between in Mickey Mouse, right? There's a difference between Pluto and Goofy. Goofy is a dog that is anthropomorphic and very human-like, but then Pluto is just a dog, and it's a mystery. But one's domesticated, one's sentient. But then you also sort of have your wild animals. Maybe good to kind of make this distinction as you are working on your fauna. So we have flora, we have fauna, but we also have conlang, right? Conlang is the constructed language of your world. So Tolkien was a linguist. He was a philosopher. He was, really kind of crazy about language. And he says all great story worlds have some sort of unique spin on language, what he calls constructed language, or shortened it, he calls it conlang. Okay, and so obviously in the Lord of the Rings, he created multiple full languages. Elvish and Dwarven, right? Just you can speak all of them, right? And completely, it's really interesting. Complete languages that he built out. In Star Trek, you have Klingon that you can speak, complete language. The Dark Crystal has its own language. In Game of Thrones, you can speak Dothraki and Valyrian. If everybody just spoke English all the time, it wouldn't be interesting or cool, right? Again, in Pandora, the Na'vi speak Na'vi. In Watershed Down, the rabbits have their own language. There's Hyrule has its own languages. In A Clockwork Orange, if you've ever seen this movie, this is a really interesting aspect of this movie where sort of this dystopian crime drama, but everybody still speaks English. But the teenagers in this movie have such a distinct slang, it's almost like a different language. So when we're talking about conlang, it doesn't always have to be a completely foreign language. It just can be a unique spin on an existing language, like in A Clockwork Orange, or like in a storyboard like Deadwood on HBO. Deadwood is a real historical place, but for the show, they made this really interesting blend of Victorian, beautiful, Shakespearean, Victorian type of a language, but then kind of mixed it with like the worst potty mouth, F-bomb, C-word type of like offensive cursing you could ever imagine. And they blended it all together in this really interesting fictionalized way for the language of that world. And people actually didn't talk like that, but it just made for an interesting spin on the language that actually supported their theme in a really interesting way. One of my favorites, I think, is Firefly and Serenity, and where they didn't invent a language, but they did a spin on language that was kind of cool, to where in the future, when we colonize other planets, everybody speaks English, but everybody curses in Chinese. Right. So one, that's a really clever way to have your characters curse on broadcast TV without getting dinged by the censors, but with just a really kind of cool, interesting spin that made that world unique. Right. So they didn't invent one word of a foreign language. They just kind of created this really interesting extra mechanic. So we have flora, we have fauna, we have conlang. Also, just as a note in conlang, again, if it's a real world story world, understand regional dialectics, understand sort of phraseology and little idiosyncratic type of phrases that people use, whether it's in the country or Appalachia or in the bayou, or figure out like words and phrases that people use in those parts of the world to help it make it more contextual and more realistic. So then we have culture. So this is the last aspect of Mythopoeia. So we have flora, we have fauna, we have conlang, and then we have culture. And culture is basically just how people live in the world. Sort of, if you were to spend, if you just lived in the world and spend a year, what are the things that you would just interact with culturally and you want to make note of, right? So some of the important cultural things to make note of, one is just religion. So you think of something like Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones had multiple complete full religions that George R. R. Martin built out. Well, he had to figure out the old gods and the new gods and the red god and the mother and the father and the warrior and the prayers people prayed to them. And most people don't like to do that, but the fact that he did that just made this world really super unique, and made it feel different and cool, right? And so religion, just a really important aspect of culture. You see that in Futurama. You see that even in something like Planet of the Apes. Funerals, another aspect. How does your world treat its dead? And is there an interesting way that you can put a spin on that? That is a very cultural thing, right? Whether it's a Viking funeral, whether it's if you have the real world place like New Orleans, they actually give you a parade going to the graveyard. They have a really different way that they treat their dead in New Orleans, as opposed to something like Los Angeles, very different, and New York, very different, right? Like everybody has different spins on it culturally. You want to understand whether it's a real world place or a fictional place. Is there a cool aspect of how people treat the dead that you could introduce that would make it interesting, right? Recreation, like what do people do for fun in your world? I think Quidditch was one of the smartest, most interesting aspects of Harry Potter. The fact that that there are intramural college leagues now that play Quidditch, I think is just a fascinating thing. But again, just help make that world unique. As a kid, I always wanted this cool Star Wars chess table with holograms. Really important part of the recreation of that world. Now, even in solo, obviously they have the card game Sabacc. And what this does is actually not only helps world build, but also creates licensing and tourism merchandising opportunities for you later, right? You can actually sell these games in stores, which I think is good for the brand. So think about what people do for fun in your world and how they can recreate. Currency, like what do how do people pay for stuff? One of the coolest aspects of John Wick is all the crazy currency that John Wick utilizes in that world. There's all these really super specific kinds of coins that have different purposes and meanings, and it's just it's a really cool aspect of that world. So what's an interesting spin on currency that you could actually introduce, and how does it work? And you don't have to be an economics major necessarily to figure it all out. I don't want you to go super deep in it, but is there some interesting aspects of it that you can utilize, right? So in in Fallout they use bottle caps, right? So bottle caps become currency. Is it more of a barter society? Do they have sort of gold back currency? In Game of Thrones, everything's backed by the Iron Bank, which is interesting. So just think about that. Like, what's the currency of the world? How can you put a unique spin on it, right? And then communication. Like, how do people communicate in the world? Is it in Game of Thrones, obviously they use ravens, which is really super interesting and cool and unique to that world. I love, in Star Trek, they have the tricorders. In Star Wars, they have the holograms that pop out of the computers, right? Like, how do people communicate? Create a unique aspect to that for your story world, which I think is kind of cool. Is it possible to flop gender roles? Gender roles. One of the coolest things about Wakanda is the fact that the badass protectors of the world were women instead of men. Just made that world unique, right? Is there who hunts and who takes care of the kids and who goes to work and things like that? Is there a way to kind of flip flop that in a really interesting way, to subvert expectations and to make it kind of interesting? What about holidays and festivals? Holidays and festivals, whether it's something like Life Day in Star Wars, or maybe it's Unification Day in Firefly, where that's the day when the Alliance squashed the rebellion, and so now they have Unification Day to celebrate that, right? So what are the major holidays of the world, right? And you know, and what do they mean, and who celebrates them? And so as you go through flora, fauna, conlang, the cultural aspects, you know, currency, communication, holidays, um, you know, funerals, et cetera, all the stuff we just talked about. The more you start to make note of these things and really kind of pay attention of how, based on your high concept, how will your high concept impact all these things? And so, because of your high concept, you know, how is currency different? Because of your high concept, how does it impact plants and animals? Because of your high concept, you know, what are the different holidays that you could incorporate? So think about these things and incorporate these things into your world building, so that once you have the architectural elements of the big idea of the geography and the population of the world, right, set, once you understand who your character groups are, once you pepper in the mythopoeia of flora, fauna, conlang, and culture, all of a sudden now the world just starts to come alive in a new way. It feels lived in. It feels like a real world rather than just an exercise that you have in world building. So once you have this together, then you really have you know, the major aspects of the world outside of the next thing that we'll be talking about, which will be the history of the world. But now you do have the present day world pretty much filled out, which is pretty cool to see how all this stuff is coming together. And then the next video we're going to come back and watch will be about building the history of the world, which will be the last aspect of world building that we'll cover.